We're now officially going to begin. The sound checks are over. So this is the for real me talking. This is the one where I do invite you to listen, as long as I'm not boring you. I want to thank you for making time in advance. You've seen those emails go out from Martha to ask you to spend some time reflecting, to spend some time revisiting the diocesan synthesis. So I want to thank you for making some time and some space in your minds and in your hearts for our formation today. And for those of us, or those of you who are joining us on YouTube and on Zoom, thank you for carving out time in your day to listen with us, to reflect with us, to pray with us. I'm going to begin this morning with just a little bit of a recap of that synthesis map that's found on page 22 in your diocesan booklet. Just as a little refresher. You'll notice that the Eucharist is at the center. The Eucharist is the center, not only of our faith life, but it's also the organizing reality through which we must read each of those pillars, those things that are in purple. It's the organizing reality through which we have to reflect on and understand every insight that emerged in the synthesis, in the synodal process, because we are a Eucharistic people. From our listening sessions, 3 pillars or anchor points emerged: Synodal Community, getting back to basics, and our rules and policies. And as Father David noted, these pillars do not hold up the Eucharist. Rather, the weight of the Eucharist presses down through them. The weight of the Eucharist and our reality as Eucharistic people is manifested in this sort of dynamic relationship of those three pillars. And I think we can and should reflect on each of these pillars in dialogue with one another. And in fact, what I'm doing today is going to be kind of a bridge between the synodal community and the back to basics. But when we're reflecting on these pillars together, we have to do it with reference to the Eucharist. The Eucharist needs to be the middle term through which we reflect on and think about each of those pillars and then every other insight and reality that emerges. There's a third level of insight that emerged, and those spoke to the relationship between these pillars. For example, the pillar of synodal community can be brought into dialogue with that pillar of rules and policies. And what emerges when those are joined together by the Eucharist, what emerges is a Christ-like exercise of authority. But of course, when the Eucharist is not the middle term, the way that we exercise authority is, well, it's not Christ-like. We'll just leave it there. The same can be said for holistic formation and the desire to combat a culture of fear. They don't reflect the reality of the pillars alone, but those realities as grounded in the Eucharist. We heard many voice a desire for a more intentional practice of servant leadership, a greater respect for human dignity, and also the need to be conscious of who we are including and excluding by the way we speak about ourselves as church. And these desires are placed on the diagram in relation to the pillars as seem most appropriate, as outcomes of the dialogue between the different levels and the center, the Eucharist. See, fundamentally, this diagram is meant to be dynamic and to suggest ways of reflecting on our reality as a Eucharistic people. And I encourage you, as we continue these formation days, to return to this diagram. After Father David's presentation in November, can you believe it was that long ago? November, the Synod Core team met and realized that we needed to spend a little more time thinking about what it means to be a synodal community. And this whole process is, as Sister Leticia reminds us, a practice of discernment. We're not blindly following a curriculum. So that's why you saw some emails that went out that said today is back to basics, and others said it's Synodal Community Part 2. It's because we realized we need to do a little more work to bridge that. And in discernment, again, as Sister Leticia reminds us, repetition is important. So as we see new things and revisit old ideas, old memories and experiences, may our reflection become more profound. And now we can get rid of that slide. And it's just me for a long time, and I apologize for not having a PowerPoint. In his talk, Father David reminds us that we need community. We are made in the image and likeness of a triune God, who is the communion of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, in his work on the Trinity, St. Augustine of Hippo thought, what is it that reminds us? What is it that I can find in the human person that is the image of God? How can I find the Trinity? And originally he thought it was going to be in our memory, our understanding, and our will. But eventually Augustine realized that the key to discovering the triune image of God in ourselves is love, because God is love. So the Trinity is the communion of love between the Father and the Son that spills over into creation. We might imagine that the Holy Spirit is this rubber band of love that binds together the Father and the Son, and in the incarnation stretches to catch up all of creation. We're made in the image and likeness of a God who is love and who loves, and whose love stretches to include all things. We're made in the image of this love and find our deepest fulfillment when our lives manifest this kind of generous, expansive, unifying love. Sin, of course, makes loving others difficult. If it were easy, Jesus wouldn't have needed to say that the first commandment is to love God and the second commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. Drawing on the wisdom of St. Teresa of Avila, Father David reminds us that living in community and loving others is going to be difficult. It's going to demand sacrifice and prayer. It wasn't easy for the saints, and it's not going to be easy for us either. It requires constant prayer and sacrifice on our parts, especially when we have to wrestle our collective way through tension and division and strife. That's just our reality. And the kind of loving community we're called to be as church is described as synodal. We're called to be a community that journeys together. And we don't get to pick who we walk with. And we don't get to leave anybody behind because they're too slow. A synodal community is therefore diverse and inclusive, even when this diversity and inclusivity lead to strife and tension. And a synodal community doesn't think of tension as a deal breaker, but rather as something we have to learn to live with, something through which God can and will work. We have to believe that God will work in all things, even in our tension and our strife. A synodal community practices broad consultation. We listen to each other, and especially we listen to those whose perspectives are different from our own. A synodal community practices co-responsibility. We're not passive. We are protagonists in this journey of faith. We're not just tagging along for the ride. And finally, a synodal community practices accountability and transparency. As Father David said, we are as sick as our darkest secrets. And so a synodal community does not hide its ugly side. We don't try to dress it up and pretend that everything's okay. And as I listened to Father David back in November, I was struck by just how difficult and countercultural of a call it is to become a synodal community, a synodal church. And I'm not actually sure we know how to do it. And so I just want to put that on the table. I'm not actually sure we know how to do it. How do we form a synodal community and make friends with those we disagree with, which, by the way, was one of Pope Francis's New Year's resolutions. Do y'all see that on Instagram? Make friends with those you disagree with. How do we do that when we live in a culture that tells us to abandon toxic relationships and demands trigger warnings on anything that's going to make us uncomfortable? How do we practice synodality? If we're going to respond to the Holy Spirit's invitation to practice synodality, we're going to have to learn to recognize when we're deceiving ourselves about the kind of community that we are. We're going to have to learn how to form authentic relationships with people who are not only different from us, but with whom we fundamentally disagree. How do we do this? That's where I want to take us today. I think we can better understand what a synodal community is by contrasting it with what it's not. A synodal community is not an exclusive group. And I say group because anything that is exclusive cannot be a community by definition. And I think it's interesting that in English, the word exclusive has quite a positive connotation. It makes us think of wealth and power and leisure and country clubs, right? The things that most people don't want to share. Exclusive groups are by nature exclusionary. They want to keep people out. And I think we need to wrestle with our temptation as a church of becoming an exclusive group, an exclusive spiritual group. The late Christian psychiatrist Scott Peck writes, quote, true communities are always reaching to extend themselves. Communities do not ask, how can we justify taking this person in? Instead, the question is it at all justifiable to keep this person out? End quote. And I wonder if this question can help us understand what it means to be missionary disciples. Our practices of discipleship, our practices of church, have to start at home, in our families, in our offices. And if we're making a deliberate decision to exclude people, then perhaps we aren't really practicing synodality. Because synodality is either local or not at all. If we're excluding people, perhaps we really aren't living as missionary disciples. And just as a side comment, I've been thinking a lot about this question of, is it at all justifiable to keep this person out? I've been thinking about this question in relation to our belief in angels. We don't talk about angels very much, except for in Mass, right? Because at Mass, in the penitential act, we ask all the angels and saints, as well as all of our brothers and sisters present there, to pray for us. And so recently I've started to wonder, when I exclude somebody, do I grieve their angel? Did their angel need me in some way in their life? Did I just reject this person and their angel, the same angel I've just asked to pray for me? Their angel doesn't reject them. God doesn't reject them. So how can I? Do I grieve my own angel, who exists in perfect communion with theirs? Do I grieve their angel when I do this? I think most of us want to believe that we aren't exclusionary. We are nice, welcoming people, right? But even with this, we have to be careful. In the United States, we have some metaphors to talk about what a nice, welcoming country we are. We talk about ourselves as a melting pot, or a cultural mosaic, or a tossed salad. And this shows how well we all get along. But these metaphors, while well-intentioned, can actually be quite misleading. The metaphor of a melting pot, for example, suggests that cultural differences ought to dissolve to form a new collective identity. So no unique differences are retained. The metaphors of a cultural mosaic and a tossed salad work in the opposite direction. They encourage us to discount our differences as being significant. Scott Peck argues that the denial, or we might add the suppression, of individual differences is the hallmark of a pseudo-community, a fake community. Pseudo-communities do everything they can to avoid conflict. Peck writes, quote, in pseudo-community, a group attempts to purchase community cheaply by pretense. It's not an evil, conscious pretense of deliberate black lies. Rather, it is an unconscious, gentle process whereby people who want to be loving attempt to be so by telling little white lies, by withholding some of the truth about themselves and their feelings in order to avoid conflict. But it's still a pretense. It's an inviting but illegitimate shortcut to nowhere. End quote. Peck continues, in pseudo-community, it is as if every individual member is operating according to the same book of etiquette. The rules of the book are, don't do or say anything that might offend someone else. If someone does or says anything that offends, annoys, irritates you, act as if nothing has happened and pretend you aren't bothered in the least. And if some form of disagreement should show signs of appearing, change the subject. we don't ever do this. So good manners help us avoid making others feel uncomfortable and therefore help us avoid conflict. Younger generations have asked for trigger warnings and encouraged a cancel culture in order to avoid dealing with things that make them uncomfortable. In church work, we go one step further. We attempt to heal or convert those who make us uncomfortable. Does somebody's brokenness and vulnerability make you uncomfortable? Fix them. Does somebody have a different understanding of God than you do? Convert them. Whether we are being polite or avoiding being triggered, whether we are healing or converting others to our way of thinking, we are effectively just trying to suppress and erase our differences and disagreement. Because it's easier to try to suppress and erase difference than it is to live with it. And when we do that, we create pseudo-communities, not synodal communities. But our nature, as beings created in the image and likeness of the triune God who is love, love that is overflowing, demands more than a fake community. We are made to live in a group whose members, and here I quote Scott Peck again, we are made to live as a group whose members have learned how to communicate honestly with each other, whose relationships go deeper than their masks of composure, and who have developed some significant commitment to rejoice together, mourn together, and to delight in each other's conditions as our own. We are asked to become a church that, as Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world says, embraces as her own the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the people of this age. Embraces, not erases, not suppresses, not ignores, not runs away from. We are made for community. So what do? Where do we start? I want to suggest that we start with ourselves and with our friends. After all, Jesus has called us friends. Father Partita talked about this in his homily. And so surely friendship is the key to the type of community that we're supposed to become. And I expect that many of us realize that when Jesus called us friends, it wasn't like a Facebook friend or other types of social media friends. I'm too old now to know other ways that people are friends on social media. And it's also going to be different than how we think about our friends who are our gym buddies or the people that we hang out, we play ping pong with. The people that we spend time with, but whom we don't actually share the depths of who we are. So I want to suggest that we try out the fundamental practices of community with those that we already love and gradually expand our capacity to love and to welcome others into community as true friends. I want us to work towards this resolution that Pope Francis set for us, to make friends with those who disagree with us. But how do we do that? How do we make friends with those with whom we fundamentally disagree? And after years of practical research, Scott Peck identified a crucial stage to community making. And he gave all sorts of wonderful examples of communities being formed of completely random people who were not in any way politically or religiously affiliated. They had differences, and they came together as community. And he said, this is also the key to making new friendships. It's very interesting for us as Christians, because what he writes the key is emptiness. Emptiness is, of course, a crucial idea for those of us who believe that Jesus Christ is the incarnate Son of God. The word we use is kenosis. And we find this idea in Paul's letter to the Philippians. There, Paul writes, "Have among yourselves the same attitude that is also yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God something to be grasped. Rather, he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, coming in human likeness, and found in human appearance, he humbled himself." We're called to take on that same attitude of emptying ourselves. Christ's kenosis, his emptying of himself, was necessary so that he could say to us, "I have called you friends." But what does it mean for us to empty ourselves in order to become friends and to build community with others? Peck explains that in becoming a community, Each group member needs to empty themselves of their own barriers to communication. So you see, this isn't some sort of crazy self-sacrifice. We have to empty ourselves of our barriers to really listening to one another. We have to first become aware of and then empty ourselves of our feelings, our assumptions, our ideas, our motives, our prejudices, and our expectations. And interestingly, Dr. Marisa Franco, who's just published a book on friendship called Platonic, it's an excellent book, I highly recommend it, has identified a similar phenomenon in the art of making friends, but what Pett calls emptiness, she describes as authenticity. And I'm going to quote her here at length. She writes that authenticity is not, quote, a knee-jerk reaction we indulge in when we feel bruised. It's not wildly expressing our thoughts and feelings with wanton disregard for everyone else, having no filters. Blaming, putting down, or attacking. These behaviors are more raw than they are authentic. Instead, authenticity flourishes in safety. It's the state of presence we access when we aren't hijacked by our defense mechanisms. We often distance ourselves from our true feelings for what feels like the sake of our relationships, our self-esteem. We contort our natural feelings and instead justify, rationalize, or dismiss. When we dislodge these defenses, what we find is that we are loving creatures who value connection. So how do we dislodge our defenses and empty ourselves of our feelings, our assumptions, our ideas, our motives, our prejudices, our expectations? Dr. Franco suggests that we need to become aware of our feelings and how we project them onto other people. She writes that, quote, projection occurs when we assume our feelings mean something about the other person who provokes them, rather than reflecting our own psyche. Projection muddles our feelings with our evaluation of the other person. Avoiding it requires us to own our feelings instead of shaping them into character judgments. When we do this, something remarkable happens. We can look at the other person with whom we struggle to enter into a relationship and honestly say, it's not you, it's me. It's not you, it's me. And when we choose to let go of that feeling, of that projection, we can encounter the other person as they actually are in themselves. And when we do that, we discover that we are both loving creatures who value connection, even if we disagree about things. So let me give you an example of how this might work, a real life practical example. I sometimes get really angry at home, really angry. Sometimes I feel resentful that I'm doing another round of dishes. We don't have a dishwasher. And I have 2 kids. It's a lot of dishes. Another load of laundry. Cleaning up again. Responding every 5 seconds to another, mama, mama, mama. And I can project all of that anger and all of that resentment onto my husband and onto my daughter, thankfully not onto my son yet. And I can think all kinds of things about them, none of which are very nice, and I'm not going to share them with you. But when I stop and I use my emotions as clues about me and what's going on with me, this is what I discover. I'm tired because my 5-month-old son is teething, and I haven't had a good night's sleep in a long time. And I'm not receiving any help because I haven't asked for any help, because I'm ashamed to ask for help. I think I should be able to do all this by myself. So what do I need to do? I need to ask for help so that I can take a nap. And when I take a nap, all those feelings are going to be gone. If we don't see our feelings as clues, then we're going to act out inauthentically and defensively, destroying relationships as we go. Dr. Franco gives us some other examples of what this might look like. And remember, as I'm giving you these examples, you are analyzing yourself, not the people you work with. You're going to be tempted. She writes, if we can't tolerate feeling inadequate, we may get defensive in conflict. If we can't tolerate our anger, we may act passive-aggressively or aggressively. If we can't tolerate rejection, we may violate boundaries. If we can't tolerate guilt, we may try to overextend ourselves. If we can't tolerate feeling flawed, we may apologize. We may fail to apologize when warranted. We may blame others or tell people they're sensitive or dramatic when they have an issue with us. If we can't tolerate feeling insignificant, we may dominate others. If we can't tolerate sadness, we may avoid those who need support. If we can't tolerate tension, we might withdraw instead of actually addressing problems. If we can't tolerate feeling insecure, we may brag about ourselves while putting others down. And if we can't tolerate feeling unliked, we may act like someone we're not. So here's a practical thing we can do as we attempt to become a more synodal church. Let's practice noticing our feelings about people and remembering that our feelings are just that, our feelings. They reveal something about us, not about the other person. And having acknowledged those feelings, let's empty ourselves of them. Let's set them aside so that we can authentically encounter the person in front of us. Which brings me to the second step. As we encounter the person in front of us, let's not withhold the love that naturally springs up inside of us. I think we're afraid of showing our love for people for lots of reasons. We've been through HR training and sexual harassment training, and we are afraid of getting in trouble. But we're also afraid of being rejected. And because we're afraid, we never let people know that we see them as they are, in themselves, that we value them and love them for who they are, not for how productive they are, for how clever they are, for how efficient they are, for who they are as workers, as ministers. And that fear drives us back into ourselves rather than going out and extending ourselves in love. It drives us back into ourselves and prevents us from entering into true community. And so I'm going to give you some examples of what this might look like. I'm going to tell my team what I love about them. Maria Antonia, I love how you mother your daughters. You're an absolute inspiration for me. Steve, I love your confidence in prayer. I've never had that. I've always wanted it. I love it. Sonny, I love your courage in letting things go, in taking a step forward into the unknown. Daisy, I love the kind of daughter that you are for your mother. And I think she's so lucky to have you. And Noemi, I'm still just getting to know you, but I love that you make us cupcakes. I love that you go home after work and you're still thinking about us and thinking about ways that you can bring us joy. And butter and eggs are so expensive now, and you keep making us cupcakes. You're just so generous. I love it. So as we empty ourselves, as we encounter the other person as they are in themselves and practice actively loving them, we build authentic relationships. We become a synodal community. In doing so, however, we have to learn how to navigate issues of vulnerability. I just got vulnerable, did you see? Maybe you didn't see on YouTube. I cried a little. Mutuality and privilege. We have to learn how to navigate vulnerability, mutuality, and privilege. And I want to start with the issue of vulnerability. Dr. Franco writes that, quote, "What feels vulnerable to us reveals something deeper about what we've learned to be ashamed of," end quote. When we're vulnerable with others, we have to trust that they won't cast us off because of what we've just told them. But in fact, the research indicates that we are cherished most because of the vulnerability that we express. Not because of the great things that we do, not because of the strengths that we show off. We are cherished most because of the vulnerability that we express. But vulnerability has to be expressed in lockstep with the trust that is being built. It's not all or nothing. And this is hard for us, especially at the DPC, where we've done a lot of faith sharing. Maybe sometimes that faith sharing is authentic, maybe it's not, maybe sometimes it's oversharing. But oversharing can be detrimental to this whole process of forming community. Because, as Dr. Franco writes, quote, instead of conveying that we like and trust the person we interact with, which occurs when we share gradually, oversharing often conveys that instead we need to get something off our chest, and any listener will do, end quote. And so as I reflect on this, I see the importance of being intentional about community, about being a community that walks together for the long haul, because we have to build trust. We can't just say, hey, we had a synod, now we're synodal. We have to intentionally work to build trust, intentionally practice vulnerability with each other, and intentionally admit that we cherish each other for our weaknesses, not just our strengths. In an ideal world, as we empty ourselves of our barriers to communication, as we recognize that our feelings about people are different from who the person actually is in themselves, as we practice intentionally loving and showing affection, as we build trust and practice vulnerability, we will also grow in mutuality. What's mutuality? Mutuality is the practice of being able to zoom out and to consider another person's needs alongside your own, and to recognize that those needs are just as important as yours. Maybe the priority needs to be a little different, but their needs are just as important as yours. So let me say this again. Mutuality is the practice of being able to shift your focus away from your own inner reality and consider the actual needs of another person, not the needs that you are projecting onto them, not the assumptions you have about what you think they need, their actual needs. And so you see, we can only do this if we practice self-emptying. But there's a catch in all of this, which is that our relative sociocultural privilege shapes how we can practice mutuality. Dr. Franco explains that in research, they find that, quote, when people from disadvantaged groups act as their true selves, that is, when they let down their defense mechanisms, their behaviors are often misinterpreted through the filter of devaluing stereotypes, end quote. And so people from disadvantaged groups often feel pressure to act inauthentically, to file down these misconceptions. And if this is true, and I suspect that the experiences of many in this room would say that it is true, this is going to be a real challenge to practicing synodality. Dr. Franco suggests that the way through this difficulty of privilege, through that temptation of acting inauthentically because people are going to misunderstand us, her solution is set up with reference to a study by a psychiatrist out of Yale, I believe. His name was Emil Bruno. This study tracks Mexican Americans and white people. And in this study, Mexican Americans and white people shared short essays about hardships facing their groups, their respective groups. So Mexican Americans shared essays about hardships facing Mexican Americans, and white people shared essays about hardships facing white people. And after reading each other's essays, white people felt better about Mexican Americans. They had more positive feelings about Mexican Americans. But Mexican Americans felt worse. That is, they had more negative feelings about white people. However, when the dynamic was changed to one of actual listening and encounter, the outcome improved. When Mexican Americans shared their personal story of hardships, actually shared it with a white person in person, and that white person then summarized what was shared and said it back to the person, both groups' views of each other improved. So those of you who have been in pastoral work for a long time, I think you recognize that. I'm going to summarize what you've just said and say it back to you. That's the practice of active listening. And it seems to be the key to practicing a mutuality that can compensate for our relative privilege. Because when you know people better, and when people know that you've really heard them, they're going to like you better, even if your differences remain. Drawing on this research as well as others, Dr. Franco recommends this practice of adjusted mutuality. And she writes, quote, "We must compensate for an inequitable status quo When disagreements arise related to race, ability, or any identity group divided on axes of privilege, the more privileged group must listen and then empathize more to achieve true mutuality. Because in the work of Black feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, treating different things the same can generate as much an inequality as treating the same things differently. And in the church, I want to suggest that this practice of adjusted mutuality ought to be, we ought to try it out in situations where there's not just a difference of socioeconomic privilege, but also where there is a difference of pastoral or spiritual privilege. So in other words, bishops, I don't think there's any bishops listening to me today, priests, deacons, religious sisters, church employees, we need to listen more and empathize more with those who don't hold these positions if we're going to become an authentically synodal church. This practice of mutuality, which is rooted in our ability to recognize and then empty ourselves of our feelings, our assumptions, our ideas, our motives, our prejudices, our expectations that are barriers to communication. This practice is the key to living in tension and learning to disagree without causing rupture. It's the key, I think, to upholding what Father Partida back in October taught us is the oldest tradition of the church, peace and unity. So how do we disagree without causing rupture? How do we work toward peace and unity without feeling like we've compromised? How do we live with tension and even reconcile this tension constructively and creatively? And I'm going to say, I think this solution is so simple that it must be right, because the simplest things normally are the right things. When our defense mechanisms are in play, we approach conflict as if it is combat. We try to win. We try to meet our needs at the expense of the other. And in doing so, we fail to love our neighbor as ourselves. To move past this, we have to practice self-emptying. If we're angry, we have to see our anger as pointing to a need that we have. It signals a need that ought to be properly named and identified. If we've made another person angry, then we need to read their anger as a signal of a need that maybe they haven't expressed yet. And we need to work to identify that need and soothe that feeling. That's especially our responsibility as more pastorally privileged persons. The conflict can then shift from combat to the question of how can we honor both of our needs? Because if we're going to be a church that journeys together, that embraces the joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, we also have to honor those needs that emerge as we rejoice together. We have to honor each other's needs as being mutually important. So let me recap. In the diocesan synthesis, as in the national synthesis and the working document for the continental phase of the synod, there is expressed a clear desire for a synodal community. This community grows out of our identity as a Eucharistic people. A synodal community is not a pseudo-community. It's not a fake community. It does not avoid conflict. It does not practice exclusivity. Instead, it practices vulnerability, striving for a kind of mutuality that honors the needs of all as being important. And this mutuality is then reflected in authentic servant leadership and co-responsibility for the mission of the church. But the church, and those who call ourselves members of it, only become synodal through kenosis, through self-emptying. And self-emptying doesn't mean self-sacrifice. It means letting go of those things that keep us from hearing the perspective of the other and seeing their needs as important. When we're able to recognize our own needs and the needs of others as being equally important, then we'll finally be able to journey together. Thank you. And now we're going to have an opportunity for questions. And I think I've got one question coming. So if y'all have questions, take a moment, think of them. We're going to have the mic. I think we have a mobile mic. Do we have a mobile mic? We have a mobile mic. And I've got a question here. Oh, what Scott Peck book did you quote from? The book is called A Different Drum. Yeah, A Different Drum. I actually have it in my footnotes. Because, you know, sometimes I make footnotes. It's called The Different Drum, Community Making and Peace. And it's a fabulous, fabulous text. Second question. How can we practice self-emptying and mutuality in the middle of archaic attitudes and power struggles in our parish? Well, I'm glad I don't know who wrote this, because I'm just gonna point something out. Archaic attitudes is a perspective, an idea that you got to empty yourself of. You got to start right there. You just labeled something. So how do we practice this? You have to practice self-emptying and saying, okay, I acknowledge that I'm really uncomfortable with this situation. I don't like it. Why don't I like it? What do I need? I need to feel valued. I need to feel like I can contribute in some way. I need to feel like my perspective is important, that my role is important. Okay, now how are you going to get that need met? How are you going to get that need expressed? Because if you don't express that need, it's like me being tired and grumpy. If I don't say I need a nap, nobody knows that. So we have to first identify that, identify those perspectives, let them go, figure out what the need is that is manifesting in this feeling, and then actively work to get that need heard and met. All right, has the mic wandered? Does anybody have a question for me here?
Right here.
All right, wonderful, thank you.
I don't have a question, I just have a comment. And you reminded us of discovering the saint within us. Because if we discover the saint that we are called to be, we will remember the trajectory of the saints that we have already shown us the way to follow Jesus as the Eucharist. And one example that I was thinking is St. John Paul II. He said to the youth, and he said to us, not to be afraid. So if we are not afraid of discovering who we are, we will be able to be those synodal people that you are calling us or reminding us to be.
There's a great point there, that we have to also be willing to be who we are, to discover who we are. To name these feelings, to name our needs, is maybe something we've never done. And it can be a little bit scary. And I actually want to go back to this question about archaic power struggles, because I want to add something. A power struggle is a defense mechanism, right? And so if there is a power struggle, if you can be the bigger person and step back and zoom out, can you figure out why this person needs to be in power? What is that hiding? What is that compensating for? And if you can figure out what that need is, if you have that capacity and that sort of that wherewithal, which maybe you don't, and that's okay, but if you do, and you can figure out how to meet that need without addressing and attacking the defense mechanism, then the power struggle is going to go away. It's like I have a 3-year-old. I'm an expert in power struggles, okay? When 3-year-olds are zooming around the house, not following any directions, doing the exact opposite of everything that they're supposed to be doing, and definitely not going to bed, I could either engage that head on and get really, really angry and yell and say, you need to go to bed or I'm going to do blah, 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 blah. Or I could just say, come here, sweetie. I think you're really tired. I think you're really tired. Come in for a cuddle. Let's sit down and have a cuddle. Go ahead and feel really sleepy. Let's relax. Take a deep breath. Good night. Sometimes it works. Do we have any other questions? Elder's got the microphone.
John.
I see John has a question.
Yes, but a comment first. I think maybe the culture, the modern culture that we're living in, particularly with social media, really pushes us more towards self-centeredness and challenges the idea of self-emptying. And Amanda's talk has been really good in helping us understand that we have to kind of deal with our own stuff first, and we're doing that. But can you tell us what kinds of, I guess, prayer and meditation and putting the devices down can help us to get more in touch with, get out of ourselves and develop that, I guess this sounds like a chore, what you're describing sounds like a chore, but it's really a blessing when you can get rid of your own stuff for a while and have, it's a positive thing, it's an affirmative thing to take interest in someone else and their experience. But how can we do that in our faith life, in our prayer life?
Thanks, John. That's a great question. And this is by nature me, and maybe other people have other solutions and other approaches to this. I think this is a really good one. It's a traditional one. I think we have to be silent in prayer. I would challenge any of us to go into the chapel and to try to sit with your own mind before Christ for 10 minutes. And everything will come up. Everything will come up. All of your feelings, your emotions, your frustrations, to sit there in silence, to let go of the need to organize your prayer, to have a formula to it, just to sit there in silence. Now, we can work towards silence. There are different sort of traditional prayers that help us work towards silence. One of those is Lectio Divina. Lectio Divina is practiced individually, not in a group. So to sit with Scripture, to read Scripture slowly, to not try to analyze it. And let me tell you, I have a PhD in theology. This is really hard. I want to sit down and analyze Scripture, right? But to just stop that and to say this isn't about figuring out the historical, cultural relevance of this particular word and why this author picked it. It's not that. It's what is that word saying to me? What is that word just triggered in me? Why did it trigger it? God, what's going on? What are you showing me about myself? Another practice is the practice, one of my favorites, is the practice of centering prayer. For those of you who don't know centering prayer, it's essentially a modernized form of a traditional sort of monastic type of contemplation. And what you do is you simply sit down, you set your intention to be open and present to God, to submit your will, your mind, your whole self to God. That intention is really important. And then you essentially just try to, as you feel or think or have things come up, you practice letting them go. You practice self-emptying. And normally you do this through the use of a sacred word. Not a mantra, but a sacred word, a word that signals back to your soul and to God that you have set this intention for total surrender. And so centering prayer is really a prayer of self-emptying. And again, something I'd suggest, start with 5 minutes, work up to 20. But start with 5. 5 is hard. Those are my two recommendations, really. I think that a traditional form of Lectio Divina done privately, and also the practice of centering prayer. Those would be sort of my keys to learning how to empty myself, how to recognize my feelings, my attitudes, my prejudices, my motives, and to just let them go. To not try to justify them, just let them go. I got a question. What was that book by Dr. Franco? It's called Platonic, and it's about friendship. It's about the science of attachment theory. So there's lots of stuff in there that's really great that I didn't mention, but it's a fantastic book. Just came out. I highly recommend it. And I see another hand went up for more questions. Beautiful.
Good morning. My name is Miguel Zaragoza. My question is, how can you get along with those people that when you get together, only thing they do is hurt your feelings? We still have to gather with them, or we just pray for them?
I think that's a really great question. What do you do when you're with people who just hurt your feelings all the time? And I think that this is where we have to be really prudent. And we never want to exclude them. We never want to make a deliberate decision to keep them out of our life. Our hearts need to be open to them always. But I don't think we need to just sit back and take it. I think we have the sort of the scope to say, I'm not really in a place right now where I can absorb your negativity. And I love you, but I'm going to need to step away because I don't have the capacity to handle this right now. I think that's okay. We need to be honest about what we can do and what we can't do. We don't need to stay in an abusive relationship. What we're called to do is to forgive the person and to continue to love them. And that's really hard. This is like one of the hardest things that Christianity teaches, right? Like, Jesus was crucified and he died loving the people that killed him. That's hard. Thank you. Other questions?
A lot of great content, a lot of things for reflection. So not so much questions, so much as just maybe a comment or an observation that a couple of things seem very important for Synodal Community, based on what you said. One of it is just self-reflection. Just a lot of self-reflection that's necessary. And I'm not sure we or I always stop and say, okay, what am I feeling now? Why am I feeling this way? What am I projecting? What are my needs? What are their needs? There's a lot of self-reflection involved in this if we're going to build a synodal community, even in a family, let alone in other places as well. Then secondly, it just sounds like thinking about this and going forward just requires a lot of intentionality. Mm-hmm. These are things that just don't happen by themselves. They're encounters that don't happen by themselves. Sometimes I need to plan it and make it happen. And even thinking about days like today, this is intentional, not necessarily the purpose of building community, but intentional going deeper on the synthesis, on the synod, how we can be a better church, how we can be better as a DPC, how we get along, work together a little bit better. There is a lot of intentionality involved. When we step into whatever our meetings might be in our spaces and kind of going with that attitude, and not just the attitude, but putting it on the agenda in some ways, it requires a lot of work, of self-reflection and intentionality.
Yeah, thank you. Ooh, we have an echo. All right, so I'm not seeing any other hands. Are there any other questions coming in from? Oh, I see a hand. I feel like an auctioneer. We're going to keep raising the price. Laura.
Thank you, Amanda. Great reflection. Thank you. I will add to the two disciplines or habits that you recommend. I will add spiritual direction, because I think it was St. Augustine who said that sometimes we are our worst counselors. So a person who can walk with us and help us understand what is God's plan in our life is great for this emptiness, and then to really do God's will. So that was my recommendation. And also in regards to Miguel's question, as a leader in the diocese, I have been experiencing a lot of great benefits and a lot of great blessings being a leader, but also a lot of difficult in situations where I need to deal with people who are really, as you were saying, like criticizing or negative about many things. But I think through a spiritual direction, I learned how to pray with them, not also for them. And just to think about what is going on in their lives that make them react like this. So one of the things is always for me, it works to ask them, is there something going on in your life that I can pray for? So it was just something that I would like to share. But thank you for.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. The spiritual direction is an incredibly important practice. I know sometimes it's a luxury, something that we aim for, maybe rather than as a given, but definitely something to strive for. And then, I think Laura's just reminded us that in those sort of relationships where we have people who are just constantly putting us down, if we do have the capacity, if we can find it in ourselves, I think we can recognize that putting us down as a defense mechanism. And we can ask that question, what need is this covering up? Why would somebody feel the need to put another person down? What is it that they need? This was, I'm going to share something. I'm not going to use names. When I was, years ago, I was a teacher at a school in a different country. That's how general I'm going to be. It was an all-boys school at the time. And there was a boy who was about 12 years old who was acting out. He was just incredibly aggressive and defiant, and basically what we would call a bully. And I looked at him one day and I said, insert name here, "You need a hug." And he looked at me and he said, "My dad beats me." And I think I learned in that moment that there is a kind of, there's a defense there. And so what Laura said is absolutely right. We need to figure out what is going on in this person's life. If we can do it. I don't want to say you have to do it. I don't ever want to say you have to take it. But if you're in a place where you can, if you can sort of zoom out, then do it. If not, it's okay to step away and to hold the love and the forgiveness in your heart. Thank you, Laura. Oh, we've got another question, another yellow paper. Okay. What about improving structures that prevent injustice and empower victims? Well, I think there's a lot sort of going on in this question. And I want to start with empowering victims. And we empower victims by listening to them, by really hearing them. My personal perspective here, and I'm not trained in psychology, so I defer to those who are. But my personal perspective is that we need to listen to victims deeply, and we need to help them move past identifying as victims. Because I personally don't ever want somebody to feel like a victim for the rest of their life. I want them to feel healed. And I think healing is the first. Healing comes from listening and from hearing the profound hurt and pain and brokenness and need. But what about improving structures so that we can prevent this from happening? I think this again goes back to this practice of being intentional about walking together. I don't have an easy answer to this. I think we have to learn to build trust. I think we have to learn to call out people when they're being inauthentic, especially as a church. We have to especially call out our leaders when they're being inauthentic. I hope that my team would call me out when I'm being inauthentic with them. Because when I'm doing that, I'm not giving them the best of myself, I'm giving them a defense mechanism. So I think we need to find a way to grow in trust and in mutuality so that we can start to hold each other accountable. I was in a listening session yesterday for the Continental Phase, and this idea of holding people accountable came up. And it struck me in that moment that in a synodal church, holding somebody accountable means something very different than my sort of reflexive American understanding of holding somebody accountable. Because when I think about holding somebody accountable, I think about taking them to court. I think about calling the debt collection, right? That kind of like very negative, almost retributive sense of holding somebody accountable is what comes to mind. But we're talking about a synodal church. We're talking about holding somebody accountable as we are holding their hand. And that's a real challenge. I don't have a way to sort of describe that, but I just want to offer that image. We need to hold somebody accountable for being authentic at the same time that we are holding their hand and allowing them to express their woundedness and their needs and their vulnerability, and we can't reject them. We have to hold their hand. So I'm sure there's, a lot more work to do on this issue of structures. This will continue to come up in this process of discernment and reflection. I think it's come up before, and it's something big that we need to talk about. So I'm not exhausting this here. I'm just trying to plant some images and some seeds. Thank you. It's a great question. All right, so we've been here for about an hour. I think we're going to take a break. Those of you who are joining us on Zoom and on YouTube, you're going to see a screen pop up with a process that I invite you to enter into, especially if you're working at a parish right now as part of a parish team, or if there's somebody that you can share with. There's going to be a process on your screen for you to read and to enter into. Those of us who are here in this room, we will come back in about 15 minutes to do this process together here in this room. All right, thank you. So let's take a break. Let's have a stretch. Thank you, those of you who joined us on Zoom and on YouTube. Thank you so much.
Okay, so for you who are connected through live stream through YouTube, we do have some announcements. Please find the Diocesan Synod resources in our diocesan website at sbdiocese.org. You can access today's presentation by Dr. Alexander and all other videos from past formation days. Also, our next Diocesan Synod Formation Day is February the 3rd, so please mark your calendars, and you will be receiving an email invitation to remind you. Also, the Diocese of San Bernardino is pleased to invite you to a special Formation Day on Synodality presented by Pope Francis biographer Austin Ivory, which will take place February 3rd and 4th. You can register for the February 3rd morning session, which will be in English, and the evening Spanish session for February 3rd, which will be from 6:30 to 8:30, and then the February 4th, it's a Saturday, from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. in English, all taking place here at the Pastoral Center through the QR code that's on your screen at the moment. So just take a picture of that QR code, and that will send you directly to the registration page. Thank you.